Hey y'all, in this video I'm going to show you how to create this really fun piece of lettering illustration, and I'm going to walk you through my process of doing this. So starting with our blank canvas, we're going to go ahead and pull up a reference image. This isn't something that I do all the time, but I like to do it if there is a specific image or vibe or color palette or style that I'm going for. So you're going to go to image and you can import your own image. I'm going to pull up this image that I found on Google of a Greetings from Tucson sign that I thought really fit that retro vibe of the Greetings postcard that we're going for. So we have that pulled up and we're going to pull that off to the side. Reframe our canvas so that we can see both kind of at the same time. You can also make this smaller if you want. Great, so the first thing that we're going to do is to build this kind of staggered letter effect, we're going to use word builders. And we're going to go to our brushes and word builders. Now these are something that I downloaded as part of a pack a while ago that included these word builders as well as individual letter builders. These are really nice for building compositions because they give you a lot of fun different shapes. They're mix and match. You can actually use them as a brush, but resize them to whatever size you want to fit. So we're going to just take the simple shear option here. So once we have those created, we're going to go ahead and group those layers so that they'll just be together and easy to access later. So you're going to select both layers and group. And then we can take that group in our selection tool and move this to wherever we kind of want to start building these main letters. So in order to build the letters, we're going to first just do a simple sketch. So we're going to create a new layer and choose a pencil tool. So I just like to use the standard 6B pencil that comes with Procreate sketching brushes. It doesn't really matter what you use here as long as you can kind of be loose with it and not be constrained by too much streamline, etc. Again, this is just to set up the framework of our letters. I'm actually going to reduce the opacity of these word builder layers as well so that we can better see our sketches on top of it. So I'm going to reduce each layer to about 50% and then go back to our sketching layer. So again, we're going to choose the pencil and pick a different color. And before we start sketching, we want to consider these two separate shear objects as two separate baselines. So this is one baseline and this is another. We can adjust the letters after we draw them, but just to get a general idea of the size of our letters, we're going to use these as a guide. So I'm going to start out with the letter S. And again, it's super helpful to have this reference image here so that I can kind of see how I want these letters to be built and start roughly sketching these out to get the right kind of vibe that we're going for. And don't be too precious with this. This is actually just a sketch that you're going to use as a base in order to build your letters later. So we have our first letter, we have that on this top baseline. We're going to build our second letter on this bottom one. You can use these widths as widths of letters, but I kind of ignore them mostly so that we can have space to fit the entire word. But I'm basically just considering this entire block as our guide. You'll just want to generally eyeball and make sure that your letters are around the same width, but we can also fix that later. Something that I also like to do is hold down the line as I'm drawing in order to make sure that it's straight. So as you're drawing a line, in order to make sure it's straight, just don't pick up your pencil and it will automatically straighten it. So at this point, we can actually turn these guides off and then take a look at our sketch that we've done. And I know it looks a little bit funky with the spacing, with how staggered everything is at the moment. If we want to fix that, we can actually select the letters that we want to maybe scoot up. Again, I'm just using the freehand selection tool. It doesn't really matter if this looks a little off sketch-wise because we're going to trace over it later. So I'm going to take these bottom letters and scoot them up a tiny bit. You can also adjust individual spacing here, but other than this H, I'm not too worried. So that staggering looks a little better, but I think I'd actually want my letters to be a little bit taller. They look a little bit too short. So I'm going to go to the selection, select the entire layer. I'm actually going to distort this and just pull it straight up. Just to elongate those letters a little bit. I think that looks pretty good. It's all at the same angle, it's a little bit offset, and it's spaced out pretty evenly. At this point, we can take our entire layer, turn on our magnetics, and make sure that we are working in the center of our canvas. So there we have our sketch that we're going to work off of to build our letters. So now that we have our sketch complete, we want to trace this with a monoline brush and start to create our really straight lines to build the actual letters that we're going to build off of. So I'm going to go to my brushes. I'm going to go to one of my favorite monoline brushes, which I downloaded from a different creator. And I'm just going to change our color to basically black so that we can see the straightness of our lines. So then you're going to want to create a new layer. You have your monoline brush selected. And then you're going to start tracing your sketch as best you can. Again, holding down the pencil as you draw each line so that you make sure that each line is straight. So once you're done outlining a letter with your monoline brush, we're just going to fill that in so that we make a solid letter. You can do that by just dragging the color into the object that you just outlined. And then we're going to repeat that process with the rest of the word. Okay, so there we have it. We have our word all blocked out. Now we can turn off our sketch layer. We're gonna go ahead and rename this layer so that later down the road, when we have a bunch of layers and duplicates happening, we can know where our original letters live. So I'm just going to name this somewhere. And then I'm going to go ahead and recolor this. So I think I'm going to make these letters pink and then use the same kind of orange that the drop shadow has here. So for the letters, I'm going to select my pink, but something that I like to do just to make sure that all of our pixels are covered, go to our layer, click Alpha Lock, which means that you've just completely removed the background basically. Then clicking Fill Layer, and then undoing the Alpha Lock. Now in order to get this 3D effect that we see in our reference image here, we're going to do something called an extrusion. So what you're going to do is just duplicate your letters and then do the same thing that you did with the fill color before, but do it with your shadow color. So for our shadow, I'm going to use this orange color. Select that, do the same thing, alpha lock your layer, fill it, undo the alpha lock, and then with this layer selected, we're going to do a motion blur in order to start that extrusion process. So you'll find that with your magic wand up here. Go to motion blur, click layer. And what you're going to do is start with your pencil, holding down on the corner of a letter, it doesn't matter which one, and then pull it down in the direction that you want the 3D object to go. So as you can see, we've got our motion blur started with this angle here. Now it is very faint right now, as you can tell. It's very blurry. So in order to darken that, we're going to go to our layers, extrusion layer. Actually, I'm going to rename this just so we are super clear. And then you're going to select that layer. So we have our motion blur selected. And with that same color selected, you're going to select the layer again, click Fill Layer. And as you can see, that darkened our motion blur shadow. It's not quite enough though, so we want to do that a couple more times. So again, we're going to select and Fill Layer. As you can see, it's getting more pronounced. You can do this however many times you want. I just like to do it enough that you start to see some harder edges. So I'm going to do it one more time. And as you can see, we've started to create some harder edges. They're still a little bit blurry though. So in order to fix those edges, we're going to select a hard airbrush. So if you go to your brushes, go to airbrushing, and click hard airbrush. You're going to make sure that your same color is selected. Make the brush as big as it will go. Make sure you can see your entire object. Go back to your extrusion layer, select it, and with that layer selected, you're going to take your brush, hold up as high as it can go, and you're just going to color in the entire layer. So what this is doing is, since this brush has a hard edge, it's actually sharpening the blurry edges of the pixels of our selection as much as it can. So once you're sure you've covered the entire area, you can zoom in and you can see that we've got some nice hard edges now. So we're going to go back to our extrusion layer, zoom out again so you can see your entire thing. And since we want our 3D object pointing this way, we're going to make sure that we're on this layer, click our selection tool, and just drag that entire layer down so that the edges of the extrusion layer line up with the top and left edges of your letters. So again, you can see that I'm just moving it to align with the top and left. Unselect. And as you can see, that gave us a really nice 3D effect that's perfectly aligned with the letters that we created. So now we're going to want to add some shading to the 3D object layer. As you can see in our reference image, the letters look even more 3D by the fact that there is some shading differences within the 3D. So in order to get that same effect, we're going to create a new layer above our extrusion layer. And then using the multiply effect, which if you go to this N next to your layer checkbox here, and right now it's on normal, if you scroll this down, you can actually go to the very top selection, which is multiply. So that just means that the effect of this layer is going to multiply the color of the layer beneath it. But in order to do that, we need to make this layer a clipping mask. So you're going to select your layer, click clipping mask, which means that anything we do in this layer is only going to apply to the layer below it, which is perfect for our shading because that means that we can shade without having to worry about going past any of the edges of the lines of the extrusion. So we're going to rename this layer. And then we're going to go back and select our monoline brush, because we want some nice straight lines here. I'm going to bring the brush size down a little bit. And then what you're going to do is basically just look at your letters, look at the different points of the letters, and see kind of where you can differentiate the edges or the sides of these 3D letters. So for instance, with this S, we can see in this example that the edge that is kind of behind the letter in front of it is going to be darker. So in order to get that effect, we can make a line that starts at this point of the S down to this point. And again, with the top of that edge, just drag a line that is parallel to the one you just made. and then drag your color into that object. And then you can see when you turn your pink layer back on that you have a nice edge created that has the multiply effect. So we're going to do that again with this edge. Again, you're just going to want to make sure that your lines are parallel. And we're going to include this edge in that as well. Connect those lines. It doesn't really matter what this connection looks like because you won't be able to see it. And then turn that back on. So now we have some nice edges created. If you want to really intensify this effect, you can use different amounts of shading. For instance, you can create another clipping mask. Also set that to multiply, but reduce the opacity of that multiply, maybe to 40, so that the color is a little bit less of a contrast. And then you can just create different types of edges. So for instance, this edge is a little bit softer because it's not directly behind one of those other letters. So it's just a little bit lighter in color. But when you move on to other letters, you'll start to see that it becomes pretty easy to connect these corners. And then create your shapes and fill them in. And if you don't have a corner to specifically connect it to, you can kind of eyeball it. So you can just end this line right behind that O. Again, just creating a shape and filling that in. So we're going to rename this layer to shading lighter, since it is the lighter multiply shade. And you can switch back and forth between these layers depending on which shade you want to do. So for our darker shading, we'll go back to this bottom layer. And again, same thing, just creating shapes. So something that I'm running into with this specific edge is that these multiplied layers are going to overlap with this edge of the O and this bottom edge of the M. In order to fix that, you can kind of hack it and you can go into your darker shading and just erase the bit that is overlapping. Okay, so now that that's done, we have a nice 3D lettering. I think it looks really great. I do want to add a little bit more detail within the actual top letter layer. So we're going to start with an outline. There's a couple different ways to do outlines. I mean, you can really meticulously trace every letter that you already created, which won't be perfect, but is an option. You can do a clipping mask within this layer, which also would be a little bit meticulous, but also an option. I find that the easiest way to get a perfect outline is kind of hacking it again. So we're going to create a small blur around this top layer, and we're going to turn that blur into an outline. So what you're going to do is take your lettering layer, select that, you're going to duplicate it, we're going to rename this to outline, and you're going to fill this layer with whatever color you want your outline to be. So I'm going to do a little bit of a darker outline to start out with. So again, to fill our color layers, we alpha lock. I'm going to take a darker orange, fill that layer. It looks a little scary right now, don't worry. Turn the alpha lock off. Make sure your outline layer is selected, and then go to the magic wand, Gaussian blur. We're going to do this on the entire layer, and you just are going to slide to adjust this blur. And as you can see, we can go really crazy with it. However, for outlines, it's recommended that you really don't go above 5%. So we're going to go with about 4. As you can see here, we have a 4% blur. We're going to do the same thing that we did with the extrusion and solidify this blur by duplicating the fill. So you're going to select your layer, go to select. We have our entire blur selected. Go to the layer again, click fill. Select, layer, fill. We're going to do this 3 or 4 times. And again, to harden these edges, since they are a little bit fuzzy still, we can take our hard airbrush, turned up to max, make sure our layer is selected, and go over that. Just making sure you cover the entire area again. As you can see, that's hardened the edges a little bit. And then we have an outline. You can't really tell that it's an outline. So if we drag that layer below our lettering, make sure that the clipping mask is turned off so that it's not reading for the extrusion layer. So now you can see that we've created a nice outline. Something we can do to actually make this an outline and not just a solid fill that's slightly larger than our lettering is take this layer with our lettering on it and turn it into a mask. So what you're going to do is select your layer with the lettering, make sure you've selected the actual lettering, click invert, go back to your layers, go to your outline layer, and then click mask. So now what this is doing is it's taking the layer that we're masking, which is our lettering, and completely erasing that from our outline layer. So if we turn our layer off and turn some of this crazy shadowing off, you can see that this is turned into an actual outline. This is going to come in handy as we add a little bit more dimension into our lettering. So in order to get this kind of double outline effect, what we're going to do is we're going to copy our outline layer. So go to your layer that says outline, duplicate it. It's going to duplicate the outline and the mask. Make sure you're only selected on the new outline. In fact, we're going to rename this just to be clear. We're going to name it Inline because we're going to take this outline and kind of offset it so that it's inside of our lettering and making it look a little bit more dimensional. So in order to do that and move our inline layer above our lettering, we're going to select and fill our inline layer with whatever color we want that to be. So since we went darker for the outline, I'm going to go lighter for the inline. I'm actually going to do white. So select this white color, select fill layer, and now we have this outline that is a different color. In order to put this outline into our layer, aka make it an inline, we need to make this a clipping mask. So click on your inline layer, click clipping mask. So now it's acting as inside of this pink lettering. And then you're going to make sure that layer is selected, and we're just going to nudge it down. So you can actually just click a couple times below your selection and then to the left. And just kind of play around with that. See what looks good. Just to kind of offset that inline a little bit. And again, it's nothing too crazy. It's just adding a little bit of dimension to our letters. All right, so you can continue to play around with this lettering. You can add additional shadows or details into your letters here. You can just do that simply with clipping masks. So if I wanted to add some additional shadows or elements into this layer, I would just create a new layer above it. It's clipping masked to the layer below. Choose a darker pink, maybe even add some texture with a different type of brush. Let's see. And I'm just freehanding this, but you can kind of do whatever you want. This is where we're at with our 3D lettering. Looks nice and dimensional, a little bit staggered, a little bit fun. So now we just need to add some finishing touches. I'm going to go ahead and select a background color. So if you go to your layers and go down here to background color, I'm going to use this kind of mint green that feels very retro. And you can do whatever you want with your background. You can add some texture, you can add a pattern, but we're just going to start with the solid color for now. And we need to add our second word in here. So I'm going to turn on my drawing guide so that I have some nice straight lines to follow. And I'm going to create a new layer above everything. just gonna do a simple calligraphy brush. So I'm gonna go with this brush pen. I'm gonna turn my streamline up a little bit. Going to choose my color. We'll just go with this dark orange for now. So using our drawing guide as a baseline, I'm just gonna sketch out our second word. I'm not too worried about how this looks quite yet. I'm gonna rearrange some things, but compositionally, I just want it to kind of fit in this area. So now that we have that sketched out, I kind of want to fill this space even more with maybe some kind of funky shape or background to this brush pen element. I'm going to create a new layer and drag that below our brush lettering. Again, make sure the clipping mask is turned off. And I'm just going to take a standard paintbrush with a hard edge, a round brush here. Select maybe one of our lighter colors and just kind of roughly draw out a shape of some sort. I'm going to clean up the edges a little bit more. So it looks like our lettering is not quite dark enough. So we can actually change the blend mode to multiply on this as well to kind of mimic some of the shading that's happening below. We can also work with this background color, make it a little bit different, a little bit lighter maybe, so that it's not so heavy. Here I'm just going to play with the values of this color. I'm going to bring up the lightness a little bit and bring down the saturation a tiny bit. It's starting to look a little bit better. Now I'm thinking that the start might be a little bit too dark. So I'm going to choose our lighter orange and drag that into our color to change it. Now we basically just need to add some fun details. So we have our background color. I like to use a shade just a little bit lighter than the background color, sometimes darker, but I like the way that lighter kind of plays with the darker elements on the page, and I like to just add some fun embellishments that kind of add to the story and the personality of the piece. So looking at our inspiration, I really like these kind of retro shapes that are happening with these mid-century looking starbursts. Let's see if we can do something like that. And before we start doing those shapes, we can start kind of resizing things so that they fit and make a little bit more sense. To me, immediately, something that stands out is that the somewhere should be a little bit larger in comparison to the start. So in order to resize all of that at once, I'm just going to group everything related to that word. So in order to group things, you can just select the top layer and then just start clicking and pulling to the right to add to that selection. So again, we're just selecting every layer that's turned on that's related to the word somewhere. And then we're going to group that. And then make sure you select the entire group. Go to your selection tool. We can turn our magnetics back on just to see if we're centered. And then you can drag this object and just resize it however you want. And then we can group our start as well. Select that group, resize that, move it around. Cool. Now I feel a little bit better about the sizing of everything, and I can start to add those fun background elements. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to move this layer all the way to the bottom, just above the background. Select whatever brush you want to use. I'm fine with this paintbrush for now. Select a lighter color. Let's see. Play around with the sizing, and then just start to draw some of those fun shapes. Now that we've gotten those background elements added, I think the only thing this piece is missing is a little bit of background texture. I'm going to go ahead and close our reference image. I think we're done with that. I'm going to add another layer right above the background. Select our background color. Again, I'm going to make this a layer multiplied, but I'm going to bring down the opacity quite a bit, so it's a very subtle addition. And you can select really any texture brush that you want. Procreate has some great textures pre-added. We're going to select a grunge. I know that grunge sounds kind of scary, but if you bring your brush way up and again have your opacity turned down, it'll be very subtle. So we're just going to cover some area in the back of our composition. Try not to worry too much if you covered everything. Then you have a super subtle background texture. And that's it. I think we're done. We have a nice composition that speaks to a retro piece of inspiration. It has personality, it has fun elements, it has dimension, it has a limited color palette. I think it looks really nice. So from here, all you have to do is sit back and admire your work.